Good morning.
Good morning.
It seems that everybody's taller than me. I'm always low on the podium and everybody else is raising it up. It's really good to see you guys here this morning on this Father's Day Sunday. It's really cool to be able to spend some time together with our fathers and with those who are family important to us, and I'm grateful for you guys being here today. For the last few weeks, we've been going through the book of Luke. Today we're in Luke chapter 6. As we've looked at the stories that Luke is sharing, we've talked about the fact that he was not an eyewitness, but he was one that went out and researched, kind of like a journalist, goes out and gets all of the information. I was talking with one of the police officers the other day, and I was asking him, so if you go to a scene of an accident, how many people do you ask what happened? And he said, everybody. The more information you get, the more accurate your story is going to be. So that's kind of the way I look at Luke. Not that it's more accurate than the other Gospels, but rather that he's gathering all of this information so that he can tell someone else about it. And it's really kind of fun to think about Luke as they called him the physician, maybe a doctor, someone who had high intellect, but the way he shares all of this information is, I'm gathering it all together because I want to share with you that all that we've heard is true. So we've seen some different things about Jesus. We've seen that he's the creator of all things. We've seen that he is the debater of the law, the teachers of the law. He's the debater of those who are Pharisees and Sadducees, and he keeps things scriptural, trying to follow God's word. And so as we look at these things, we also see that he was last week we talked about the fact that he was the one who is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so that's an important part of this as well. But today I want to talk about Jesus, the chooser of the apostles. Whenever you think about choosing apostles, what would you be looking for? What is it all about? Who are the apostles? Why did he choose them? Why did he choose 12? What was it all about? So as I was looking at this, I was wondering, how many people did he have following him? It indicates let's see here, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 5, it says that there were over 500 brothers who were following him. That's what Paul said about the followers of Christ. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 15, it said there were about 120 gathered in the place where Jesus appeared after his resurrection. In Acts chapter 1, Luke chapter 10, it's recorded that there were 72 disciples that he sent out in pairs. And he sent these disciples out while he was yet walking on the earth. It also tells us in Acts chapter 1 that, after the resurrection of Jesus, Luke records that the apostles, his mother Mary, other women, and Jesus' brothers were staying in the upper room where they joined together in prayer constantly. And I'm just guessing, but there was probably somewhere 20 to 30 people who were followers of Christ. And here in Luke chapter 6, we read that he chose 12 of his disciples to be apostles. In addition to that, we learn that in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 37, that Jesus chose 3 particular men to go with him: Peter, James, and John. Also, when he ascended to the top of the mountain, and the Mount of Transfiguration, we call it, during that time, he took the same 3 men with him. So it kind of, people conclude that he had a special relationship with James and John and Peter. But then there's one I love John. When you read the book of John, he keeps referring to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. And I just like that. I think that's a great title that he gives himself. But, I always kind of looked at it as almost arrogant, that, hey, I'm the one that Jesus loved. But I really think that what it was he felt so loved by God that he just was overflowing with the love that God gave him. But he did have a special relationship with him, one that might have been different than the others. Peter recognized it. Whenever Peter is talking to Jesus after the resurrection, they're walking along, and Peter is answering Jesus' questions, and he says, feed my sheep. Remember that? 3 different times, and then he says, Peter, this is what's going to happen. And he tells him about how he's going to die. And then Peter turns around and he sees John following him. He says, what about him? And Jesus says, don't worry about him. I'm talking to you. If I want him to live until I come back, what's that to you? So there's a rumor that passed around that John was never going to die, that he was going to live forever. But the truth was that Jesus loved all of his disciples, all of his followers. But what constituted a disciple? Who was a disciple? The word disciple means learner or follower, someone who followed Jesus. So that could have been any of them. There were a number of people, and like Paul suggested, there was probably over 500 people that saw Jesus who had seen him before, but now they see him again after he rose from the dead. So you see that there are many, many disciples, followers of Jesus. Now, there were some devout followers of Jesus that went with him everywhere he went. It mentions Mary, his mother. Also, Mary Magdalene is mentioned a few times. It mentions some other women who went with them, traveling with them to help. Also, there were the 12 disciples that become apostles. And we see also that there were many others who actually went with him and traveled along with him. So all of these stories, all of these representations of Jesus and his relationships with others tells you something. He cares about people. And he wants to share with them what he has, what his knowledge of God is. And seeing how he was God, become man, and then after his death returned to the Father and once again to the position of being part of the Godhead, I believe that we can see here that as he was here on this earth, he chose those who would help him to spread the news about God and who he was. That's actually what the word apostle means, is to share, to teach, to preach to others. They are the sharers of God's good news. It says that he gave them the power to do miracles, that they were able to heal the sick, that they were able to cast out the demons, that they were able to pray for those who are in need. And so God gave them some special powers. But why these 12 men? What was it all about? I'd like to read from Luke chapter 6, and starting with verse 12. He says, one of those days Jesus went out to the mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When was the last time you spent the night praying to God? If you're like me, 15, 20 minutes and I'm out cold. I don't last very long when I'm praying. How can he pray all night long? But we have many examples of him doing this, that he would go into the wilderness by himself so that he could talk to God. I want you to imagine that for a minute. When I was living over in Western Washington, over in Bremerton area as a 18-year-old, I was working with the church over there, and I would come home every once in a while. And as I got home, my dad and I would go out to do some work, tractor work or whatever, and we'd get to talking. And I'd just ask him all of the questions that I've been thinking about, Questions like, how do I know who the right woman is? Those kind of questions, the tough ones. And as a father, you're looking at him and saying, how am I supposed to know that? but I longed to come back and to talk to him and share with him the things that was going on. And I enjoyed those times. I looked forward to getting back together with him. Jesus didn't have a relationship with God that I'm calling a transactional relationship. That wasn't the relationship that he had with God. He had a close, interwoven relationship with God. He submitted completely to the Father. I'm calling that a transformational relationship. Now, we know that Jesus was not only man, but he was also God in man. And that's hard for me to wrap my mind around, to fully understand that. But whenever you think about it, he knew things. And it said when he was baptized that the Spirit came upon him and dwelt in him. So he had this special Spirit working through him and in him. So he probably had some extra knowledge than what we might have. However, we have the Spirit living in us too. So maybe it's about the same as what we have today, but more so than the others did at that day. Because when Jesus left, he said, I'm going to send one who will take my place, the one that will be your counselor and fulfiller. But here in these verses, Jesus is talking about going into the mountains and praying. Not a prayer of, will you do this? Will you do that? Will you watch out? Now I don't see that as being his prayer. I see it as, God, let me share with you what happened. Let me tell you about what just went on. And sharing his life with the Father. And in turn, the Father sharing with the Son. I see there being a relationship that's not about a checklist of, did I remember to pray for that person or remember this, but rather a relational talk with God the Father. That just kind of blows my mind when I really stop and think about that. That God was talking to him, somehow communicating with his Son. But at this very moment, at this very instant, I think it was more than just sharing about what's happening. I think he went to him and said, God, what do I do? There is so many disciples, and they're great people, but how do I disciple all of them? How do I teach all of them? Because at this point, remember, he's just a man, so he can't be in all places at all times. He's limited to the physical body, his energy, his ability, his voice, everything is human at this point. So he doesn't have the ability to be in all places at all time. He doesn't have the ability to be all over the world like he is today. So he's limited in his abilities as a human. Can you imagine being responsible for all of these people, to teach them, to share with them all of this knowledge? So I think what happened was Jesus was probably asking the Father, who do I choose to be my second in command, my disciples, my apostles, as it comes to be? You remember Moses? Moses was trying to manage all of the people who he had led out of Egypt. And as they follow him, as they go into the wilderness, he speaks to them, and he's trying to be the judge, the jury, the everything. And his father-in-law comes along and says, you're going to kill yourself, Moses. Now, this is my words, by the way. I didn't really, this isn't quoted. But basically, his father-in-law is saying, you're going to kill yourself. You can't do all of this. You need to appoint people. And he breaks it down for him. And he says, you be responsible for these 10 who are going to be responsible for these 10 each. And then those 10 are going to be responsible for these hundreds and thousands and then tens of thousands. And basically what he's saying is, you have to choose someone that you can trust to take care of the things below you. And it's not a hierarchy. It's not like that. It's more of a, I can't be everywhere at once, so I need someone to help me, to walk alongside me. And I believe that that's what's happening here as Jesus goes into the mountains and he's praying to God, and and I believe he's asking God, who do I choose? And how many do I choose? 7's the perfect number. Why not 7? And, maybe you might say, well, maybe if we had 8, 9, 10, 10's a round number, let's choose that. There were 12 tribes of Israel, so let's choose 12. I don't know how they came up with the answer, just a question that you can tell me later the answer. But in verse 13 he says, when morning came, he called his disciples to him, and he chose 12 of them, whom he also designated as apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter. Now, we know a little bit about Peter. Peter's one of the few that we actually have. I believe I read somewhere that there was 187 mentions of Peter's name. So he is mentioned quite often in the New Testament. So we know more about Peter than most of the apostles. I particularly think that's probably because he got in more trouble, because my teacher called my name more often than all of the other students in the classroom, because that was me, But I think Peter had some unique relationship with God, much like John did. John probably, they said that he was the youngest. That seems to be the consensus, John was the youngest. I think Peter was probably one of the older of the group, and one that everyone looked up to because of his personality, maybe his age, maybe his responsibility. I don't really know. Could be because he got in trouble more often than the rest. But whatever the reason was, he mentions Peter quite often. And he chooses him. But he also chooses his brother Andrew. Now, it tells us, I believe it's in Matthew, that Andrew actually saw Jesus first and went back and told Peter, hey, I just met the Savior. I met the Messiah. Can you imagine that? And I don't know. I'm guessing Andrew was probably younger than Peter. That's a guess on my part. But he goes back to Peter, and I can imagine Peter saying, yeah, right. We've heard this before. Or, sure you did. That would be probably my response. But Andrew is convinced. And then later we see that Jesus chooses Peter and Andrew. And it's almost as if when he's choosing Peter, he's trying to convince him of who he is. Andrew already believes. Andrew already knows who he is. But Peter, he says, cast the net over the side of the boat. And Peter's like, oh, man, I just finished washing this net. Okay, I'll do it. And he throws it over, and in comes a catch of fish that is so large that it nearly sinks their boat, even when they ask for help and get James and John, who are the next two in the list. When they get all of these boats together, and they still almost sink the boats. And God says, or Jesus says to Peter, in my thinking, okay, do you believe me now? And I see Peter here just being one of those ones that when he's in, he's all in, both feet, every inch of him. At one point, Jesus says, let me wash your feet. And all of the other apostles will let him wash his feet. But when it comes to Peter, no, you're not washing my feet. And Jesus says, well, if I can't wash your feet, then you can't be one of my disciples. And he says, well, then wash my whole body then. It's kind of with Peter, this all or nothing type feeling. And so Peter is chosen along with his brother Andrew. And here comes James and John, the other two fishermen that were with him at the time. And then Philip and Bartholomew. Now, we know a little bit about Philip, if it's the same Philip that we hear about. He is an evangelist, a teacher, and he is known for his ability to share the gospel with those who he comes in contact with. But here, Bartholomew, we know next to nothing about. There's very few mentions of him or what he does. But we know that he had to have been someone that God chose because of who he was and what he had done. Now, as we go through and we read these different names and we see these different lives, there's something that goes before it's even said. God didn't choose someone simply to make them into something. He chose somebody that was already walking with Jesus. Somebody that had already said, I will be your follower. I will be your disciple. Taking that, he is able to then form us, shape us into what he wants us to be. In our class this morning, that's one of the things we were discussing, was the fact that if we are wanting to be transformed into the likeness of Christ, if we want Jesus, God, to transform us, then we first have to empty ourselves. We first have to get rid of our own desires, our own selfish wants, and say, okay, God, let me be who you want me to be. And allow God to shape us, to make us into what he wants us to be. Okay, I got off my notes and I have no idea where I'm at. That's all right. It doesn't matter. So here's my point. And basically what I wanted to get to is in Luke chapter 6, in these few verses here, we see Jesus in a relationship with God that I believe God desires for each of us. So first thing I want you to recognize is if we are allowing God to be a part of our lives and allow him to speak into our lives, I believe he will guide us. He will give us direction. He will show us what we need to know. Just as I believe he did with his son, when his son probably asked, who should I choose? Which disciples should I follow? Later on, we see that Judas betrays him, which again was part of the plan. God knew that was going to happen. And yet he allowed him to be one of the apostles. I'm not sure all of the reason why, but God had a plan. And he allowed that to happen. But later on, after Judas has gone, dead, then they select another man to take his place. And what do they tell us about that man? He has to be able to know who Jesus is, to have a relationship with him. He has to have been with him and heard him and followed him from the beginning. They wanted someone who walked with the Lord. Not just somebody that happened to stumble along the camp and say, oh, I want to be a part of this. No, there was somebody that wanted to know him. And I believe that's very significant in our relationship with God. If we want to have a relationship with God, we have to be committed. We have to decide, I want God to be the Lord of my life. I have a little marking in the back of my Bible that says, if God is not Lord of all in your life, he is not Lord at all in your life. We have to be willing to surrender all to God and let him be Lord of all of our life, or he can't truly be Lord in our life. God has a desire for each one of us to have that relationship with him. Like I mentioned before, Jesus was limited in his physical abilities to be everywhere at once while he was on this earth. Now, he is in all of us. It says that when we are baptized into Jesus, we are baptized into his death. He becomes alive in us. He lives in us, and he is part of our lives. He also says that he sends the Holy Spirit to live in us. So I believe that this is going to sound really weird, we have some benefits that even Jesus didn't have at that time. We have him with us. And I think this is really cool to think about, that Jesus is living in us and he is guiding us, but we have to be willing to let him. I don't know if you guys have ever been a backseat driver, but if if there is 3 positions in the car, there is the driver, the co-pilot, and the backseat driver. And each one have their own position and own responsibility, right? The backseat driver makes sure that the driver's doing everything they're supposed to be doing. The co-pilot is the one that's helping them along, giving them directions, reading the map, whatever it might be. But the driver's the one that's really responsible for the direction of the car. There was a few years ago, a song came out, and Jesus Take the Wheel, indicating that, God, I can't do it anymore. Take over. I'm giving it to you. As a co-pilot or a backseat driver, for me to tell God how to run my life, how to do things, doesn't make much sense, does it? But yet we do it. That's where we find ourselves so often, is either a backseat driver or a passenger or a navigator trying to tell God where we want to go, instead of submitting to Him and allowing Him to be in control and allowing Him to guide us and direct us. I believe that God's desire is for us to have a relationship with Him where we can go to Him and say, God, help me. I want to know. And I believe God will show us. He will give us that direction if we are willing and ready to listen to Him and hear His will for us. And the second thing is that I see our relationship with God in one that if we are already walking with Him, walking in the light, living as He has called us to live, then He is there, ready and willing to help us. He is there. He's waiting for us to call on Him and to ask for His help and guidance. He's not a puppeteer pushing us and shoving us wherever He wants us to go. Yet, when we allow Him to be a part of us, He is guiding us and giving us of His wisdom and direction. So as the apostles surrendered their will to God and allowed God to be in control, and God chooses those He knows are best, can He do the same thing today with you and me? And what does it require of us? Everything. It requires us surrendering it to Him and allowing Him to be in control. So that's simply it. That's simply my takeaway from this passage, is that we are His. He is ours. If we want to enjoy what He has for us, then we have to surrender. And where does that start? Walking with Him, giving of our lives. And that's what we do in the form of baptism. When we start our lives with Christ, He says we are baptized into Christ. We are dying to ourselves and living for Him. That's the beginning of our relationship with God. Once we do that, then He says that His Spirit comes to live in us, that Jesus Himself is in us. And as we begin to follow Him, learning to trust Him, to have a relationship with Him, the more we learn, the more we trust, the more faith we put in Him, I believe the more that He can use us, and we become a tool for Him to spread the gospel, just as the apostles did in their day. And I think that's a beautiful part of being a church. It requires surrender. It requires us giving up of ourselves. But the outcome, the result of it, is a beautiful life with Him.